The air inside the Forrester Creations CEO office was thick enough to cut with a knife, heavy with the suffocating weight of impending doom. The anteroom, usually a sanctuary for quiet corporate strategy and hushed, high-stakes business deals, had instantly transformed into a claustrophobic pressure cooker of guilt and panic. Steffy Forrester Finnegan and Carter Walton stood frozen in their tracks, their frantic, hushed argument violently interrupted by the sudden, forceful opening of the heavy wooden door. Ridge Forrester stood in the threshold, his imposing, authoritative figure casting a long, dark, and terrifying shadow over the two people he trusted most in his professional and personal world. He had heard enough of their panicked whispers from the hallway to know that a massive, dangerous secret was being hidden from him. The silence that followed his entry was deafening, a heavy, toxic quiet that signaled a betrayal about to shatter the very foundation of the Forrester family legacy. Steffy's eyes were wide with sheer terror, her breath catching painfully in her throat, while Carter looked exactly like a man standing on the gallows, agonizingly waiting for the trapdoor to open beneath his feet. Ridge's piercing, relentless gaze darted between his daughter and his chief operating officer, his eyes narrowing as he processed their undeniable panic. He demanded answers, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed off the walls and promised severe, uncompromising consequences for any further deception. The original plan, hastily and desperately constructed in the frantic seconds before Ridge's intrusion, was for Carter to spin a believable, calculated lie. He was supposed to claim that the tension was simply him pushing Steffy to reconcile with John Finnegan, using aggressive tough love to guide her back to her devoted husband. But as Carter looked into Ridge's eyes that had looked upon him as a son, a trusted confidant, and a loyal brother for years, the lie turned to bitter ash in his mouth. The crushing, suffocating weight of his guilt, compounded by his wife Daphne's heartbreaking infertility diagnosis and his own fracturing moral compass, finally broke him down completely. Carter realized in that agonizing split second that he could not look this patriarch in the eye and deliver another sickening falsehood. The burden of the secret had simply become too heavy, too toxic to bear for another second. The moment of truth arrived with a devastating, world-altering finality. Carter, his voice trembling uncontrollably but laced with a desperate, pathetic need for absolution, confessed everything. He could not bring himself to use the cover story. Instead, he did not sugarcoat the ugly, sordid reality. He laid bare the disgusting details of that fateful, drunken night. He admitted to Ridge that after Steffy had fled Monaco, heartbroken, furious, and spiraling over Sheila Carter's presence, and after he himself was reeling from Daphne's devastating medical news, they had sought reckless solace in a bottle of alcohol. And then he confessed the ultimate, unforgivable sin. They had surrendered to a passionate, drunken encounter right there on the office couch. The words hung in the stale air, toxic, irreversible, and utterly damning. Steffy let out a strangled, horrified gasp, her trembling hands flying to cover her mouth as she watched Carter's confession systematically destroy her father's perception of her. She had begged Carter to keep quiet, to bury the secret deep in the ground to protect their fragile marriages. But now, the truth was out in the open, and it was uglier and more destructive than she could have ever imagined in her darkest nightmares. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, Ridge simply did not compute the information he was hearing. The words slept together, echoed in his mind, bouncing off the walls of his reality without actually penetrating his consciousness. This was Steffy, his golden girl, his namesake, the fierce, unwavering protector of the Forrester legacy. She was the woman who demanded absolute loyalty, transparency, and perfection from everyone in her orbit. And this was Carter, the moral compass of the company, the man who officiated their weddings and stood as a towering pillar of integrity and honor. To hear that these two individuals had engaged in a sordid, drunken hookup in the very office that represented their family's global empire was a betrayal so profound, so sickening, that it momentarily paralyzed him. Ridge blinked slowly, his jaw clenching so hard that a muscle ticked furiously in his cheek, his hands curling into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. The disbelief slowly, agonizingly, morphed into a blinding, white-hot, uncontrollable rage. This betrayal was not just a personal failing. It was a desecration of everything he held dear, a mockery of the family name. The transition from stunned shock to explosive fury was instantaneous and violent, driven by a primal, uncontrollable anger that he had not felt in years. Ridge stepped forward, closing the distance between him and his daughter in a heartbeat. Before Steffy could even utter a single word of defense, before she could open her mouth to beg for understanding or offer a pathetic excuse, Ridge's hand sliced through the air with terrifying speed. The sharp, resounding, thunderous crack of his palm striking Steffy's cheek echoed like a gunshot in the confined, suffocating space of the anteroom. The sheer, unbridled force of the slap snapped Steffy's head violently to the side, her dark hair whipping across her face as she stumbled backward, her hand flying up to cradle her stinging, rapidly reddening skin. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated shock that froze the room in time. Ridge Forrester, a man who fiercely and famously protects his children against all threats, had just struck his own daughter in a moment of unprecedented, blinding rage. Carter lunged forward instinctively, horrified by the physical escalation and desperate to intervene, but Ridge shot him a glare so venomous, so filled with lethal promise, that it stopped the Soho dead in his tracks, freezing him in place. "How could you?" Ridge roared, his voice vibrating with a volatile mixture of profound heartbreak and absolute, sickening disgust. The slap was not just a physical reaction. It was the physical manifestation of a father's shattered illusions and broken trust. He looked at Steffy not as his beloved, brilliant daughter, but as a deceitful stranger who had deliberately defiled the sanctity of her own marriage and the honor of their company. The tears immediately began to stream down Steffy's face, her chest heaving with panicked, breathless sobs, but Ridge offered absolutely no comfort. His eyes, usually warm, loving, and fiercely protective when looking at her, were now cold, hard, and utterly merciless. He paced the small room like a caged, furious tiger, the adrenaline coursing through his veins making his hands shake. He could not fathom the level of recklessness, selfishness, and sheer stupidity required to commit such a vile act, especially with Carter, a man who was married to Daphne, a woman currently suffering through her own private, agonizing hell of infertility. The collateral damage of their drunken night was astronomical, and Ridge was drowning in the sheer scale of the destruction. Ridge's fury quickly found a new, even sharper target: Steffy's blatant, sickening hypocrisy. For years, Ridge had stood by and listened as Steffy positioned herself on a towering moral pedestal, aggressively and relentlessly judging Brooke Logan for her past romantic indiscretions. Steffy had built a personal brand on being the anti-Brooke, the woman who respected boundaries, who honored commitment, and who fiercely defended the sanctity of marriage against any outside threats. She had weaponized Brooke's mistakes for decades, using them to elevate her own perceived moral superiority and to justify her endless crusades. "You have spent your entire adult life criticizing Brooke," Ridge shouted, pointing an accusing, trembling finger at his weeping, broken daughter. "You judged her, you condemned her, you acted like you were so much better, so much purer than her. And now look at you. Look at what you've done. You did exactly what you despise. You threw your sacred vows away for a cheap, drunken night on an office couch." The words cut deeper than the physical slap ever could, slicing brutally through Steffy's carefully constructed armor and exposing the ugly, hypocritical truth of her actions for all to see. The reality of John Finnegan's unwavering devotion made the betrayal even more sickening to Ridge. He reminded Steffy, his voice dripping with venom, of the loyal man waiting for her at the Cliff House. The man who had just stood before her, looking into her eyes, and vowed that absolutely nothing in their future could ever come between them. Finn, who had literally taken a bullet for her in a dark alley. Finn, who had fought tooth and nail to keep his psychotic birth mother, Sheila Carter, away from their family, sacrificing his own emotional needs just to appease Steffy's strict demands. Finn loves you unconditionally. Ridge seethed, his voice breaking slightly at the agonizing thought of his son-in-law's impending, world-shattering heartbreak. He worships the ground you walk on. He was willing to sacrifice everything for you in Monaco. And how do you repay that kind of loyalty? You rip your wedding ring off, fly home in a tantrum, and jump straight into bed with Carter. Ridge painted a vivid, agonizing picture of Finn's pure loyalty contrasted sharply with Steffy's ultimate, dirty betrayal, making the crushing guilt in the room practically suffocating. Beyond the personal devastation, Ridge was acutely, painfully aware of the corporate and familial implications of this disaster. Forster Creations was already navigating incredibly treacherous waters, locked in a fierce, high-stakes fashion war with Katie Logan Spencer's newly empowered House of Logan. The absolute last thing the company needed was a massive, sordid, front-page scandal involving the co-CEO and the COO. Ridge roared that Steffy had not only destroyed her own marriage, but had also selfishly smeared the family's reputation with her reckless, impulsive behavior. If the press, or worse, their corporate rivals, were to get wind of this drunken office hookup, it would be a public relations nightmare that could severely, permanently damage the brand Air Forster had spent a lifetime building. The CEO office, a place of legacy, creativity, and family pride, had been reduced to a cheap motel room in Ridge's eyes, and he could not look at either of them without feeling a profound, overwhelming wave of nausea and disgust. Ridge knew that immediate, drastic, and unforgiving action was the only way to contain the radioactive fallout of this confession. He could not allow Steffy to go home to Finn and pretend everything was normal, nor could he allow her to continue working side by side with Carter as if nothing had happened. The proximity was a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate and destroy them all. With cold, calculated, and terrifying authority, Ridge delivered his final verdict. He demanded that Steffy pack her bags immediately. She was being exiled from her own kingdom. "You are going to the Milan branch," Ridge commanded, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation, debate, or pleading. "You leave tonight. You do not pass go. You do not stay here and try to spin this into something manageable." The Milan branch offered the perfect, undeniable cover, a sudden, urgent, high-level business trip that removed her from Los Angeles, separated her completely from Carter, and bought Ridge the precious time he needed to figure out how to handle the impending explosion when Finn inevitably learned the truth. Steffy was utterly devastated, her entire world collapsing around her in real time. The tears flowed freely now, ruining her perfect makeup, her confident, untouchable facade entirely shattered into a million jagged pieces. She reached out a trembling, desperate hand toward her father, begging for mercy, pleading for a chance to fix the unfixable. "Dad, please," she choked out between heavy, agonizing sobs, her voice raw with desperation and fear. "I love Finn. It was a mistake. I was drunk. I was hurting. Please don't send me away. Please don't do this." She knew that leaving for Milan so abruptly would only raise Finn's suspicions and cause him immense pain. But she also knew that staying meant facing the music she was far too cowardly to hear. She was absolutely terrified of losing her husband, her beautiful children, and the perfect life she had built. But as she looked deep into Ridge's eyes, she saw absolutely no sympathy, no paternal warmth, no forgiveness. She saw only the harsh, unforgiving, and absolute judgment of a patriarch who had drawn a line in the sand that she had disastrously, foolishly crossed. Ridge did not soften or relent. He stood firm, an immovable object in the face of her emotional breakdown. He told her, his voice devoid of any warmth, that her tears would not undo what she had done, and that her crying was an insult to the people she had betrayed. He explained, with brutal, surgical honesty, that this exile to Milan was not merely a punishment, but a desperate, necessary measure to save whatever was left of her fragile marriage and the company's pristine reputation before Finn discovered the bitter, ugly truth. "If you stay here, Finn will see it in your eyes," Ridge warned her, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, absolute register. "He will know. And when he finds out that you slept with Carter while he was begging for your forgiveness, it will destroy him. It will break him. You need to leave. Now." Ridge was acting as the ultimate fixer, stepping in to manage a crisis of epic proportions. But the cost was his relationship with his daughter. He was protecting her from the immediate fallout, but he was also banishing her from his sight because, in that moment, he could barely stand to look at her face. While Steffy faced the full, unbridled wrath of her father, Carter stood in the periphery, a completely broken, ruined man. Ridge finally turned his attention to his COO, and the disappointment in his eyes was absolutely lethal. Carter had been Ridge's right-hand man, the voice of reason, the man who was supposed to protect the company and the family at all costs. Instead, he took advantage of a vulnerable, spiraling Steffy and betrayed his own wife, Daphne, who is currently suffering through the agonizing, soul-crushing grief of infertility. Ridge didn't even need to yell at Carter. His silent, disgusted, piercing glare was more than enough to convey that their professional and personal relationship was fractured, perhaps beyond any hope of repair. Carter knew that his own marriage was now hanging by a thread, and the sanctuary, the family he had found in the Foresters, had been burned to the ground by his own reckless, selfish actions. He had traded his integrity for a moment of drunken passion, and the bill had just come due. As Steffy turned to leave, her shoulders shaking with uncontrollable, violent sobs, the reality of the situation settled over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket of ash. The secret was no longer contained between two guilty, panicked lovers. It was now in the hands of the patriarch. Ridge must now carry the agonizing burden of knowing that his daughter committed the ultimate betrayal. He must look Finn in the eye and pretend he doesn't know that Steffy's sacred vows are meaningless. He must look Daphne in the eye and hide the sickening fact that her husband sought comfort in another woman's arms. The moral weight was staggering, and Ridge felt the crushing pressure of it pressing down on his chest, threatening to suffocate him. He had exiled his daughter to Milan to buy time, to create distance, but he knew deep down in his soul that secrets this massive, this toxic, never stay buried forever in Los Angeles. The truth always finds a way to claw its way to the surface, bringing destruction with it.